Hi again, I'm Saidia Gulrukh back with another lesson on ethics in visual journalism. Today we will be thinking about ethics of inclusion and the burden of undoing stereotypes in visual reporting. Stereotypical visual reportage is often not part of our ethical consideration, especially in photojournalism. However, scholars in cultural studies, media studies and visual anthropology, or even some practitioners have dealt with this question of stereotypical representation of event, community or even an individual and analyzed how it had helped perpetuate social injustice and inequalities. This is important because the way we think and the way things are represented impacts how we understand it, how we engage with the question, the community or the individual. In that sense, stereotypical images affects everyone, but it affects more the people and communities in the margin, the marginal communities. So how does that happen? Let's have a look at a few images that stereotypes. I will do a quick search in Google for images of indigenous people of Bangladesh. So let me type in, bear with me, indigenous people of Bangladesh. What do we get? Here in the first 3 rows, possibly 16, 17 or 18 images are of women dressed in their traditional clothing with traditional ornaments. What it appears, they are ready to dance for some festival. And in one exception, you see a woman carrying her child and her farming tool on her back, possibly going to her farmland or the Zoom land. It takes you to scroll down farther and farther to find the first picture of a political rally that will clue you into the history of struggle and political oppression in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. Now, why do you think these images hurt, or it carry the risk of doing harm to the community? We have talked in our first lesson that one of the first principles of ethics in visual journalism is doing no harm. And here we are talking about how stereotypical images could cause harm to the community or the event or the issues that we are visually reporting on. Firstly, so how, again, if I ask the question, how do you think these images that we just have searched in Google could harm the community? Firstly, it erases the history of state violence, military occupation in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. It vanishes the long history of indigenous people's struggle against this oppression. Secondly, it excludes women in all situations other than the situation that you see in these images. Indigenous women in the front line of political rally, indigenous women as lawyer, indigenous women as painter, even a school going girl from indigenous community, or even elected local government representative from indigenous community are not included in this set of images. And then the men in the community are totally absent in this set of images. And then thirdly, not all indigenous people in Bangladesh lives in the hill. There are Mandis from Rajshahi or Tangail, there are Khasis in Sylhet, there are indigenous people living in the plain lands of Bangladesh. But in the media representation, in the works of mainstream photojournalists, they are not represented. So the primary social function that stereotypical images do are exclusionary. They exclude realities, they exclude people, they exclude certain version of the lived realities from their representation. Clearly these images erases, they exclude, they split realities into many pieces, and such portrayals harm the community largely because they subscribe to the dominant view of the indigenous people as exotic, as oriented towards rituals, ritual without an everyday life, setting aside the complex history of political struggle in Chittagong Hill Tracts or the complex struggle of the indigenous communities in Bangladesh. These images reinforce and respond to and reproduces Bengali touristic gaze on the community and create path for the development of tourist industry that in the views of the indigenous community are regarded as cars for the indigenous community, because such touristic developments are dispossessing, evicting indigenous communities from their ancestral lands, among other things. So now the first social function that a stereotypical image plays in society, in state, in global political hierarchy, that it is very exclusionary. Now let's look at another set of images. What happens if I do a Google search of the event of the collapse of Rana Plaza, a building that has housed 5 apparel factories and killed, after the collapse or with the collapse, it killed more than 1,142 workers in 2013. The industrial accident that I just mentioned is, and I prefer to refer it as corporate homicide, is considered one of the deadliest in the recent history of global apparel industry. Now let me type in the collapse of Rana Plaza for Google image search, and what happens after I perform this exercise. The search with the collapse of Rana Plaza gives you mostly a set of photograph of the collapsed building, and then there are few that includes the rescue operation. Now what happens if you expand the scope of the search and look for the images of the victims of the Rana Plaza? What do you see? Let's do it together. So here we see a set of images that includes a woman crying in front of the collapsed building, a woman being rescued, women crying with photographs of missing victims. 2 women injured workers are holding hands from their lying in their hospital beds. Even when you see the protest against such corporate homicide in Rana Plaza, you see an injured and incapacitated woman on the wheelchair leading the protest. A woman standing with a placard asking United Colors of Benetton, "How much my life worth?" All these is true depiction of the situation in post-collapse Rana Plaza. It is true that majority of the labor force in the apparel industry of Bangladesh are women. 80% of the victims were women. But there were men too. Should we exclude them? To make my point, I would like to refer to a story of a male survivor of the collapse, Saddam. He was stuck under the rubble for 6 days. On the 6th day, he was rescued. His friend died before his eyes. One of his arms was amputated, and I met him, or I had a conversation with him that I would like to mention here. On the 2nd anniversary, if I remember it correctly, it was the 2nd anniversary of the collapse. We were standing near the site of the collapse. Suddenly he asked me, why men's stories don't count? Are we not the victim in the same way that women are? He felt disenfranchised by the dominant representation of the post-disaster representation of Rana Plaza in media. As women's stories dominated the media, possibly subscribing to the gender stereotype of women as socially preferred victim, men's stories were made invisible. Through media representation and other associated institutional and social processes, what we see is a feminization of victimhood that left little room for documenting stories of pain and trauma that men have experienced in the collapse of Rana Plaza. Visual journalism in Rana Plaza has largely excluded Saddam and his friends. Their stories were not easily recognized by the media because the visual reporters here shared the social code in which men does not fit into the category of victim. They are probably in our mind recognized as protector than victim. And here I remember, I would like to refer to a Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She termed this tendency to reproduce the same image, the same story as dangerous, as the danger of a single story. I will return to her analogy again, but I want to have a look at another set of images to discuss another attribute or another function that stereotypical images play in maintaining social order and hierarchy. So what happens if we do an image search for poverty in Google? Again, let me type in poverty. And eclectic ranges of photographs of women, children, even men from the majority world that popularly or predominantly referred as the third world will pop up. These images are portrays crowded slum situation, children waiting in line for food, people scavenging in and around garbage, skeletal children suffering from malnutrition, veiled women. And this list could be longer. If you scroll down and down, there will be repetition of the same images from different places of Asia, Africa, Latin America, but you will see a different kind of exclusion here. Here, a geographical exclusion. Here, you want historical exclusion. Here, you will not see North America or Europe included in this portrayal of poverty. But do you think realities in United States, Canada or Europe are without poverty? No, we all know it's not true. In the province of Manitoba, let me give you an example. In the province of Manitoba, the First Nation community lives in abject poverty. They, until 3 years ago, probably, if I'm not wrong, they didn't have cell phone connection. They still have lack of access to many basic necessities. They have one doctor that visits hospitals every 3 months unless there is a health emergency. So they are denied of basic public services. They are denied of state support. Poverty is an everyday reality in the northern Manitoba. But when you search for images of poverty, the realities of Canadian First Nations will not pop up. And then poverty is not an unfamiliar situation for the North American white community either. But we are not used to when we talk about poverty, we're not used to think of these realities as it relates to them. And why such exclusion happens? Because such representations come from the pre-existing ideas informed by colonial history, white supremacy, and other ideological prejudices that poverty is a reality that belongs to the third world. That means that belongs to the countries in Africa, South Asia, Middle East, but not in Europe or North America. And it essentializes certain social and political attributes for the third world. So, to summarize the discussion, the point that I have raised about undoing stereotypes, I would like to draw our attention to two primary ways the reproduction of the same image or the stereotypical images, the primary ways that it can cause harm in society, in different communities, and these are the two portrayals, the two forms of representation that we should consider avoiding. We should aspire to not fall into the trap of these kind of stereotypes, and they are because such images, as I have repeatedly said in this lesson, that these images are exclusionary. They denies community of any diversity within the community, diversity of lived experiences. It doesn't acknowledge how people live their everyday life and their political struggle. And such images essentializes reality, that there is only one kind of reality that may exist, and turns into a single story. So here I am back again with the question of single story or the danger of single story that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has mentioned repeatedly in her fictional and non-fictional works. These photos are often beautiful, you can't deny them. These photos, but they are real because poverty is a reality for many of us living in the majority world. It's an undeniable reality. But they are stereotypical as well because they exclude, they essentialize. And let me return to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's word. She says that the problem lies because the stereotypes is not that they are untrue, they are real, as I have said before, but they are incomplete. They don't tell you about the complex situations, complex realities that people in these, the subject of these images navigates every day and survives. Their resilience, their laughter, their joy, and their failure and defeat. There is no one single image that can essentially represent whole truth. And the problem with stereotypes is also its claim that it's to be the truth and the only truth. And that's why Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says they make one story become the only story, and that is the problem and the burden of stereotypical image that we have to undo. And so now how do we undo such burden that has such a long history? Undoing stereotype is firstly a question of being aware of the harm that it could cause in the communities. It is about unlearning socially internalized racial, class, gendered and colonial prejudices that are attached to such images. And it is about becoming aware of the effect of constant portrayal of such categories of images, repeating such images. For example, any majority world country as poverty stricken, it empowers the West as the donor, as the savior of the non-West, and therefore the long-standing political hierarchy are not questioned, not challenged in these images. Instead, it reproduces those hierarchies, those unequal relationships through images. And now undoing burden is one ethical consideration that is not, there is no easy one answer that how to avoid such situation. As I said, these are very complex situations because these are often real situations. For example, in Rana, we talked about Rana Plaza where 80% of the victims were truly women. In that situation, how do you accommodate men's voices so they are not excluded is a challenge. But the ethical journey for a photographer is to take up that challenge, to be prepared for that challenge, and to acknowledge that challenge exists, that I have to take up the burden of undoing stereotypes, that through my photojournalistic work that I will not reproduce stereotypes that carry forward the social prejudices that produces inequality, that are associated with social injustices. So here I am concluding today's lesson with the reminder of everyday ethical struggle of a visual journalist, a photojournalist. In the link below the description of this video, you will find 3 readings that will help you explore these questions, the questions of essentializing and question of stereotyping, excluding people, excluding community, excluding realities. It will help you explore these issues more in depth. And for this week's assignment, this week's task for us that I have set for you is I'm asking you to do the same exercise that I have done throughout this class. Find an idea, find a community or a people and do an image search for them in Google and write a paragraph about the images, whether do you think the images that you have find functions as stereotype or whether it doesn't. If you think they do have a role in reproducing stereotypical images, then propose how would you plan your shoot. You propose a plan in which you will undo that long legacy of stereotyping through visual reporting. Thank you.